Welcome back. Today we are making a cake for Hanukkah. Hanukkah's still a bit away, but there's nothing wrong with planning ahead. To make this cake, I'm using some blue vanilla cake layers, and it's going to be a surprise inside cake. So I'm using a 3.5-inch circle cutter on my 7-inch cake layers to cut out the centers from 2 of my cake layers. Now you can use whatever size circle cutter you have on hand, but just keep in mind however big of a circle you cut is how much candy you can fit inside your cake. I also cut out a bit of my 3rd bottom layer just so that I could fit even more candy into this cake. I wanted the cut to be super epic, so I have lots of space for candy and sprinkles. Just like always, I added a dab of buttercream onto my greaseproof cake board. This will help keep our first cake layer in place as we stack and assemble our cake. Next, I piped a generous amount of buttercream onto my cake layer, and then I spread it out using a small offset spatula. So I like to use a piping bag for this just because it makes it easier to get the frosting where you want it to go, right along the edge of the cake. But you could also just use an offset spatula and dab the frosting into place. Once I had stacked my 3 cake layers, I also frosted the inside of that cavity that we've created in the center of the cake, just to help keep the cake layers nice and moist. So now it's time to work on what we're going to add inside the cake. So I combined white and blue sixlets along with a beautiful blue and white sprinkle blend. I gently mixed these together with a spoon, and then it was time to add this into our cake. I carefully added this inside of my cake with a large spoon, and once I'd filled it about 3/4 of the way up, I also added in a few pieces of gelt. Then I topped it with a few more sixlets. This is totally optional, and if you're not comfortable putting candy that is wrapped inside your cake, I totally get it. You can skip that step. I wanted to do that just because I think that it makes the inside look so much more exciting when you cut in. I also put the gelt into the cake at an angle so that when I cut in, I shouldn't have to cut through any of the pieces. So once all my cake layers were stacked, I added a thin crumb coat all around the cake, and I then chilled the cake for about 10 minutes in the freezer to allow my crumb coat to firm up. I colored the rest of my frosting different shades of blue and then placed it in piping bags and piped some stripes all the way up the cake. So for these stripes, they can be a variety of different widths, and obviously you want them to be different shades, so that way when we smooth them together, you just have a beautiful array of blue stripes. Once I had covered the cake, I used my bench scraper to very carefully smooth out those stripes. Any areas that look like they needed a little bit more frosting or you can see gaps, I just took my piping bags and added a touch more. I then ran my bench scraper under some hot water, dried it off, and did a few more careful passes around the cake. And then it was time to work on our white chocolate ganache. So I've added a cup of mini chocolate chips into a bowl, and I've covered it with 1/3 cup of just boiling heavy cream. I let the mixture sit for about 1.5 minutes, and then I stirred it until it had a nice smooth consistency. I added a bit of gel food coloring to this and stirred until it was evenly colored. So you can see it's pretty thick, and you can also see that the natural color is pretty yellow, which is from the cocoa butter in the white chocolate. So just be mindful of that when you are coloring your drips. So I chilled the cake again for about 10 minutes in the freezer to help the second coat of frosting firm up before we add our warm ganache. To add the drips today, I'm using a spoon, but you could also use a plastic squirt bottle. I like to use both methods and find that using a spoon gives me a little bit more control, but it's definitely more time consuming. So the trick to doing this is, number 1, doing a test drip to make sure your ganache is the right temperature. Adjust as needed if it's not, either letting it cool more or heat it up in the microwave for a few seconds. Then take about a teaspoon of ganache in your spoon and carefully pour that on top of the cake. Then simply push that ganache over the edge, just like I'm going to do here, until it starts to run. So once you get comfortable with this, you can add a little bit more ganache to your spoon. You can see I had about 2 teaspoons of ganache in that last spoonful. And the more ganache that you add or push over the edge, the longer your drip is going to be. So here I'm just adding a little bit of ganache for my final drip and just carefully letting it flow down the cake. So now that our cake is covered in drips, it's time to cover the top in our remaining ganache. So I'm spooning on quite a bit of ganache and just spreading it using my small offset spatula. So the top of the cake is going to be covered with buttercream swirls, so I'm not too worried about getting the ganache on top of the cake perfect. To make these pretty buttercream swirls, I'm just using a small French tip and some of my uncolored buttercream. I actually inserted some toothpicks into my gelt before adding them to the top of the cake so that they can stay nice and tall and keep their elevation above the buttercream. This just makes them a little bit prettier and gives the cake a more uniform look. So now that our cake is all decorated, it's time for the moment of truth. So we're going to cut into our surprise inside cake and see what it looks like. So this is always a kind of scary process, but luckily it turned out really well with this cake. So I carefully removed my slice, and you can see those sixlets combined with sprinkles create the perfect cascading effect out of the cake. You can see the gelt turned out just fine. I didn't cut through any of the pieces, and the cake inside was also delicious. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you have a wonderful Hanukkah if you celebrate it. And hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.